Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Thursday said enhancing all kinds of connectivity, including in social, digital and financial spheres with the 10-nation ASEAN grouping is a major priority for India. He made the remarks at a virtual summit between India and the ASEAN. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, is considered one of the most influential groupings in the region, and India and several other countries, including the US, China, Japan, and Australia, are its dialogue partners. The summit took place amid China's aggressive behavior in the disputed South China Sea as well as in eastern Ladakh. A number of ASEAN countries have territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea. The ties between India and ASEAN have been on an upswing in the last few years, with focus being on ramping up cooperation in the areas of trade and investment as well as security and defense. The ASEAN region, along with India together, comprises a combined population of 1.85 billion people, which is 1/4 of the global population, and their combined GDP has been estimated at over $3.8 trillion US. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the India ASEAN Summit. Joining me on the program today are Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, former ambassador, Sriram Chawlia, foreign affairs expert, and Pramit Pal Chaudhary, foreign editor, Hindustan Times. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you first. Let's first try and understand the key takeaways from the India ASEAN Summit.
Well, I think, Frank, this has been a reiteration of our general policy and the fact that the Act East became a more robust version of the Look East. So I think what we are trying to say is that we want to, at least the Prime Minister was putting on record that we want to increase our cooperation. But there have been some, I suppose, setbacks, you can call it, because we walked out of the RCEP, which is going to be signed at this summit, or at least initialed at this summit. So we'll be left out of that. For good reasons, I'm sure, why we didn't join. And clearly it was a backdoor entry for China. But these backdoor entries are emerging in many places. I know, for example, in Bangladesh, which has duty-free access into the Indian market, China is coming up with its what you call it, the export processing zones, special economic zones. So we'll have to be careful about all this. And I think that process has begun because we have notified country of origin regulations recently, which has not been taken very kindly by Bangladesh, because this has, these are some of the factors that are coming in at the moment. Basically, countries are now, becoming more protectionist, and there is turbulence in the general order of things in the international stage. And I think we are on the cusp of seeing another reaching another milestone when I think Senator Biden becomes the president, and you might see changes coming out of the world's sort of leading power, how it will go, how it will happen. There are a lot of uncertainties now, and we are on the cusp of that. So ASEAN is also trying to grapple with the same uncertainties, including, of course, a post-COVID revival of the economy, RCEP, how the RCEP, of course, will strengthen China's position within that geography and domain, because it will what shall I say, reinforce the value chains that already exist within these countries and China. So I think China's trading and economic relations will get consolidated. But then again, if TPP comes back into play, then I think you will probably have another pillar to build a certain Asian. But I think the ASEAN countries are also deeply worried about what's happening in South China Sea, and the fact that China has been muscling into territories and economic zones that they claim. There are overlapping claims there. So I think the ASEAN is trying to pivot, or navigate between various issues and factors, and they are unlikely to take a position on. My feeling is that they are going to remain somewhat neutral, depending on which way things are heading, because China has also undermined ASEAN to a large extent. If you look at what's happening with Cambodia and Laos, so I think let me leave it there, and so that's the general picture.
Absolutely. We'll come back when we'll take the discussion forward now, Pramit. So, building on what the ambassador just said, clearly the ASEAN countries have issues with China, especially in the South China Sea, and this is something that has been there for some time now. But it's not like that they can do without China as well. So it's a difficult situation, really, as far as the ASEAN countries are concerned. And how much, can they get out of India, and how much does India want to coordinate and cooperate with ASEAN?
So for the ASEAN countries, the present, should we say, Indo-Pacific geopolitical situation is something that bothers them. You now have the rise of the Quad, which is noticeable for not having any ASEAN member at all, but it literally goes around the ASEAN, but none of their members are not involved in the rise of the Quad. They can see that their primary external security ally, the United States, for at least most of them, is increasingly not paying that much attention to Southeast Asia, or is focused only on one or two countries, notably Indonesia and Vietnam. They themselves are, as the ambassador has mentioned, are internally paralyzed because at least two of them, Laos and Cambodia, are now so close to China that they are unable internally to even come to a common position about the South China Sea. ASEAN still does not have a common official position in response to Chinese aggression, territorial aggression in that area. They also face another issue, of course, which is, as you've mentioned, that India, Japan, and other countries like South Korea are starting to build up their own bilateral relationships, which tend to no longer focus on ASEAN. So you'll notice that the Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, in some of his recent speeches, has raised, India has always said ASEAN centrality is absolutely important. But he's been saying, well, ASEAN centrality, we have to ask ourselves, does this make any sense? In other words, as long as ASEAN remains completely paralyzed, is unable to come to a genuine formal position of its own geopolitically on any important issue, then India will have to go and forge ahead, and the Quad is part of that, without ASEAN. Now, after the last Quad meeting, you saw ASEAN centrality be restated in the statements that came out from the four countries. And that, I think, reflects an agreement that at least Vietnam, maybe Singapore and Indonesia, can be brought into the larger geopolitical balance effectively against China. And you'll notice that the Americans, at least under the Trump administration, have been setting up meetings in which ASEAN plus South Korea, sometimes with Vietnam, in their meetings. So they're very clearly looking at some point in the future, a Quad plus arrangement is something that should remain in the background, or at least something everybody should think about. So ASEAN is there, but it's more components of ASEAN. So this East Asia Summit is going to be important, or should we say it's not that important, but it's a precursor to a bigger debate that ASEAN has to have about its own future at a time when the US-China relationship and China's relationship with almost every other major Asian country is deteriorating. Okay.
I think that's a very interesting point that you brought up. Let me take that point forward with the other panelists as well. Sriram, let me bring you into the picture now. As far as the points raised by Pramit Pal Chowdhury, two aspects. One, of course, is ASEAN still as important as it used to be, say, a few years ago? Secondly, going forward, should India then focus on bilateral relations with, some of the ASEAN countries rather than focus on the grouping as a whole?
Well, Frank, I think when we say ASEAN centrality, obviously we would like it to be a coherent group, because see, China is at an advantage when there is no broad-based regional cooperation. If there is a broad-based regional formation like 10 countries, ASEAN, all acting in concert, cohesive, as we say, we want cohesive and a central ASEAN for the whole Indo-Pacific, I think that is to China's disadvantage, right? So and ASEAN, they have their own internal, mechanisms and dialogue processes for unification of the bloc, and for ushering. Initially, it was only an economic integration, and they have achieved a lot through that, through free trade area. But now the question is, politically, the Chinese have, played one off against the other. So we should, I think, continue to aspire for ASEAN's unity and centrality, which we keep on restating, and which was done at the summit as well, India ASEAN Summit. But then the question is, I think what is missing is the connectivity that can actually glue them together, because the Chinese have been partial to some countries, and especially Laos, Cambodia, you can say they're almost in China's pocket. And on the other hand, the countries that resist Chinese hegemony are kept out, although China also has trade with Vietnam and the Philippines. So I think what has been missing is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, that structure. They've pretty much encompassed almost all of ASEAN under it in some form or the other. So what has been missing is an alternative. And there, Japan has been trying to put up an alternative. And the Japanese, we, along with Japan, have a couple of initiatives. One is the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which traverses the ASEAN region. The second is, recently Australia, Japan, India, we announced the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, SCRI. And that was to diversify our supply risk instead of, being dependent on just one country, which is China. This is the realization that many ASEAN countries also face in the wake of the coronavirus crisis and all that. And Vietnam has been able to attract a lot of investment fleeing China due to the US-China trade war. So Vietnam manufacturing, Vietnam export has increased, including to India. Some of it is Chinese goods rerouted through ASEAN members, about which we are worried. And that's why Ambassador is talking about the rules of origin. So the other is the Japanese have the partnership for quality infrastructure. And we have, our Prime Minister's proposed the coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure. Now, ASEAN countries, the poorer ones, are not very strong in infrastructure, and they're becoming more and more indebted to China. So this is where I think if we can put together coherent alternatives for connectivity and supply chain and for economic well-being, I think that will be, because whenever I've been to a number of these countries, I've worked in the Philippines, in Vietnam, they're often very cautious about upsetting China, in spite of the geopolitical rivalry and the threats China poses to their claims over the South China Sea region. And the reason is they say that it's China is our largest trading partner, it's our largest investor. The US is kind of missing in action. So therefore, I think India, Japan, Australia, and if the US comes on board under a Biden administration, which will have a more multilateral focus, well and good. The Quad can really energize this. And ASEAN has now come up with this Indo-Pacific outlook, Frank. What it essentially means is same thing which we all say: rules-based order, inclusive, no dialogue, no bullying, and most importantly, no distinction between Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. Now they're all one and Indo-Pacific, which is an advantage for us. It's an invitation for us to enter and play a bigger role. So I think we have to capitalize on that and continue to insist on ASEAN centrality, although we are quite pragmatic enough to realize that some of these cannot be prized away from China's orbit. But those which are willing to, we should forge ahead with meaningful cooperation with economics as the basis, because the ASEAN countries often say we don't want hard balancing against China. We don't want to become part of a military coalition or an alliance. What we want is a kind of a softer balancing. So there, I think infrastructure, economy, technology, 5G, these kind of things, if we can get our act together jointly, they will really appreciate it and come on board.
Okay. All right. Points taken. So we spent about 15 minutes for our opening remarks. I'm going to ask my panelists to be brief in the next round so that we can get closing comments in as well. Ambassador, points raised by Pramit Pal Chowdhury. Now let's take those aspects forward. Considering the current geopolitical situation, everything that's happening in the Indo-Pacific, and with the Quad and so on and so forth, do you believe it is up to the ASEAN as a grouping now to get some kind of a common ground if they have to be relevant or a force to reckon with in the months or in the future?
One thing that both Sriram and Pramit hinted at is that ASEAN cannot retain its centrality if it becomes a part of the Chinese orbit. It has to maintain its centrality by remaining outside the Chinese orbit. In other words, it needs other major powers like the USA and India and the Quad perhaps in the future to balance, whether soft or hard. I think it will be more soft balancing, because there is no need for hard balancing, because that's not something they are looking at. But I do not know how they will manage. So you will see ASEAN countries, hedging a lot and also trying to, raise red flags once in a while, Philippines, Vietnam, on South China Sea, conveying signals and warnings to China that, look, this, don't cross beyond this point. So I think that kind of signaling is taking place at the moment. Now, it all depends. After all, President Trump, by walking out of the TPP and various other, at least in the beginning, basically provided the space for China to come into this space. Now, I don't know. But later on, of course, he backtracked and had started virtually a trade war with China and squeezed them and claimed that many businesses had come out and gone back to the USA. The economy, actually, to be frank, the economy was doing rather well before COVID hit all countries and hit the economies. So, and Trump took credit for all that, America first, etc., that I will make America great again. But then he ignored the other aspects of the global kind of engagement that USA always had. But of late, I think, there has been pushback, not just under the Quad, but bilaterally. I mean, you had 3 carrier groups hovering in the South China Sea, then this whole business of selling more arms to Taiwan. So there is some kind of pushing back taking place at the moment. The Quad has had its exercises, the Malabar, for the first time with Australia included in it. So there is a kind of a sort of a rebalancing. There is a hard rebalancing in Quad, and a soft rebalancing is possible if ASEAN decides to do that.
Sure, certainly. So, Pramit, let's talk about another aspect now. Traditionally, the United States has had a major role in this particular region, still continues to do so. But, like the ambassador just pointed out, under the Trump administration, we saw a bit of a withdrawal, really, as far as the United States was concerned. With the change of guard in the United States, what's likely to happen?
Well, Biden has made it very clear that he believes that one of the biggest failures of Trump's foreign policy was, as you mentioned, his devaluing of America's alliances and partnerships. This included not just the 5 military alliances that America has with Asian countries in Asia, but also, of course, NATO and so on, and then strategic partnerships that America has with other countries like India and so on. And so Biden has made it very clear that the heart of his foreign policy is going to be to leverage these relationships to constrain China. But Biden has also indicated he wants to reduce defense expenditure and divert that to America's considerable domestic problems. So we'll see how that plays out. It's not clear to me how you can balance these two together. You expect to use your alliances, including areas in technology and economics and trade, to constrain China, but at the same time, the single measure of which I would argue China takes the most seriously, you're going to actually pull back. And it's in my view, a problem that we'll see when the Biden administration tries to apply this in the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN countries, as will India and the new government in Japan, for example, all will be waiting to see whether America or the Biden administration can square this circle to put up a robust policy towards China and simultaneously cut defense expenditure, as well as build up your alliances, and then also try to develop things like a 5G, an ex-China 5G technology coalition. This will be a huge challenge for the Biden administration, and it's going to be touch and go, I think, especially for the first year as he tries to work this out. My personal view is that China will interpret a lot of this as weakness and probably test him, possibly over Taiwan, possibly on our border as well, in an attempt to see whether Biden really has the stomach for the hard geopolitics that China itself practices.
Absolutely.
And then whether or not the real sort of Biden policy comes through out of that.
Right. Sriram Chaulia, so what should India's strategy be going forward?
Well, Frank, Prime Minister mentioned at the summit that, speeding up connectivity is our top priority. And unfortunately, our record in promising and delivering connectivity projects has not been great. Dr. Jaishankar is really persevering and trying to push very hard to complete. For example, the India-Myanmar-Thailand highway, trilateral highway, has been delayed for more than a decade now. And, there are many reasons for it. Some of it are beyond our control. Some of it just have to do with contractual, failures and, builders not delivering what they were supposed to, bureaucratic processes. So that is where, the Chinese have stolen a march ahead of us. And they are far faster in doing all kinds of railways, highways, bridges, multimodal transport networks under BRI, but also in other bilateral formats. That's the thing where, we have to learn a lot from them. Even the Kaladan transport corridor, for example. This again with northeastern India and Myanmar. For northeastern India, it will be a huge developmental gateway if these things get going. And then, further afield, I think one of the, as Ambassador was mentioning, we are seen to be protectionist and not part of the broader regional integration that's happening, especially RCEP. And we will need to find new means to integrate ourselves and for our market to be accessible to ASEAN countries. Already we have, of course, the India ASEAN FTA. Almost $90 billion of bilateral trade is going on. And I think India has a relatively small deficit of about $25 to $28 billion in that. But I think once we get the rules of origin in place, we can make sure that ASEAN is not becoming a backdoor for China to flood us. And once we have those assurances, either we go back into RCEP or we rejoin some kind of expanded Trans-Pacific partnership. I'm sure Biden administration will try to revive it in some form or the other. Japan has been leading regional integration processes parallel to China because Japan cannot accept Chinese hegemony ever. So I think we have to, hang out a lot more with the Japanese. Incidentally, while our Prime Minister was launching the ASEAN India Summit, on the same day they had parallelly the China ASEAN and also the Japan ASEAN. The ASEAN has this ASEAN +1 format, and China and Japan are also there. And if you see what is going on in those summits, Frank, the Japanese are promising a lot more investment, especially for epidemic control and for public health in ASEAN. For disaster relief. The Japanese have already become more proactive in supplying weaponry to Vietnam, and we have now given for the first time ever a submarine to Myanmar. So if you add up all those, and the Australians are very strong with Indonesia and with the Pacific Island nations which are adjoining ASEAN. So if you add up all that, there is a lot of work to be done. But if now we are prioritizing it much more under Act East. So I'm hopeful that the quicker we implement these, I think the train will start moving.
Okay, time to get quick closing comments now from all my panelists with the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
I think the best way forward is very clear, that we have to keep engaged with the ASEAN. And as Sriram said, we have to start delivering on some of the pending issues, the pending projects, Kaladan Highway, then the trilateral highway, etc. Now, I know there is a problem because Myanmar is there in between and there is insurgency. One of the problems of finishing these projects is insurgency and the threats that these insurgents within Myanmar itself has a lot of these ethnic insurgencies going on. And China is a player there. It promotes it somewhere and then de-escalates somewhere. So China is playing its own game in Myanmar, and we all know why. It wants an entry into the Bay of Bengal. It wants to replicate Gwadar in the west to I think Chuakpu in the east along in the Bay of Bengal region. So I think we'll have to keep engaging. There is no magic wand. There is no magic wand that will help us overcome all these difficulties. It's a long, hard road. It's a marathon. And I think we will have to keep engaging. And fundamentally, we'll have to ensure that our own economy starts roaring again at 8, 9, 10%.
Absolutely. All right, Pramit.
Yeah, I think we'll keep in mind this summit is essentially this East Asia summit is a holding action. It's a virtual summit. Virtual summits don't actually accomplish that much because it's the personal interactions between the ministers that really push the agenda forward, and that can't be done right now. But they're also waiting to see what is the new government in America going to be like, what is the new government in Japan going to be like. And given those situations, a lot of what's happening in the East Asia Summit will not be particularly exciting in terms of moving forward. So your really game is what is the agenda going to be next year, next 2 years, next 3 years? And I think a lot of us have mentioned we need to get the infrastructure programs. Japan has its own infrastructure program. We have our own plans. The Americans have the Blue Dot Network. Everybody has their own plans.
Right.
We need to mix them together, align them militarily, technologically, infrastructure. Right now, we have a whole patchwork of responses to China. These need to be brought together. And if as much as possible, ASEAN should be brought on board. If not ASEAN, we must be prepared to work with individual ASEAN countries rather than wait for ASEAN together on this.
All right. And Sriram Chawlia, close the show for us with a quick concluding remark.
Yeah, Frank, I think Narendra Modi government has tried to create the sense, the consciousness in India that ASEAN is actually our neighbor, our maritime neighbor. How far is Andaman Island from the nearest Southeast Asian country, Indonesia? Very close. So what I'm trying to say is, this is part of our maritime consciousness that is arising, the Indo-Pacific outlook that has emerged, and closer ties are inevitable because of the geopolitical pressure of China, but also because we are realizing that we have, as we grow, initially we said our neighborhood was only South Asia, but now the whole of Southeast Asia and beyond is also our neighborhood, as is West Asia. So our ambit is expanding, and accordingly we have to also spend more resources. We have to also give more diplomatic energy. We have to push our private companies and private sector to invest more and to go out more in this region. That is the way we'll be able to ultimately realize our goal of ASEAN centrality and a balanced Indo-Pacific.
Absolutely. All right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. So the last few years, India and ASEAN have come a long way. The relationship, of course, has gone from strength to strength. There is still a lot more that needs to be done. A lot has changed in the region over the last few years as well. What we need to focus on going forward is economy and connectivity. Let's not forget that the ASEAN countries can't step away from China because their economies are integrated and they're extremely close to China. So there's a lot in common there for the ASEAN countries and China. And let's also not forget that the Trump administration had withdrawn from the region, thereby providing a larger space for the Chinese in this particular region. But that could change with the change of guard in the US and with Quad taking an extremely active role, especially in the Indo-Pacific. What we need to do going forward is to ensure that we work on our pending projects and deliver them on time. And we need to find new ways to integrate with ASEAN. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.